So, it is 12:04. We are technically 4 minutes late. Welcome to the NRE live stream. It's the NRE Labs bi-weekly live stream where we interview people in the network automation space, interesting people. Sometimes people who are network engineers just out in the field doing networking stuff. Sometimes we have other people like today's guest, John Capobianco.
Perfect.
Perfect. I should have asked before we started the stream how you pronounce your name. Uh, John is the John is the head network engineer at the Parliament of Canada, and today he's going to talk to us about his efforts in that organization, starting an automation practice, and what automation has done for him. This is going to be very interesting. I did talk a little bit about it before we started, so I'm kind of excited. Um, and we also have Matt on the line. Hello, Matt. Otherwise known as Mearden on Twitter. He's um, the brains behind the network, the Energy Labs engine. Um, so with all that, John, why don't you tell us a little about yourself?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. This is my first podcast, so I'm a little nervous, but I appreciate that you guys inviting me along. And so for the past 6 years, I've been the senior network architect, IT integrator planner for the House of Commons, the Parliament of Canada. That includes the House of Commons, the Senate, the library, the parliamentary security offices, and some ancillary services. So this is downtown Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. We have approximately 40 buildings in the downtown Ottawa core that make up our campus. And then every uh, member of parliament has up to three constituency offices or their riding office, their branch office. So about 450 remote sites connect in as well over our VPNs. Um, when I first joined the House of Commons, the goal was to completely rip and replace their existing network infrastructure. That's data center, campus, wide area network, everything, firewalls, top to bottom rip and replace of the network. And that's what I've been doing for about 6 years now. Um, the transformation has been quite radical. When I joined, there was no Wi-Fi on the hill, so there's no wireless access points, no wireless networks.
Even 6 years
Uh,
ago?
Even 6 years ago, there was no voice over IP. It was all POTS telephones, and it was more or less a big flat layer two network that was very long in the tooth and was due to be replaced when I joined. So that's kind of setting the stage for where I've been. Um, Within the last 3 years, we started to find the scale and the complexity of this network was starting to hinder our agility, hinder our operational practices. Things were taking a very long time to roll out, mainly given to the scale, but also to the tooling and the practices that we had been using to date, which was more or less someone at my level would draft up the changes to the network, put it into a ticketing system. Someone in operations would pick up that ticket and more or less CLI into each device and copy and paste the commands in. We found that this was, it's not unheard of, I suppose, but we really
That's
wanted
very common.
very common.
That's like one of them gossip chains, right? Like, hey, you should do this, and the other person listens, and they're like, oh, and then they go down the chain further, right? And it's amazing that's an operational model people have adopted.
Yeah. So we found I particularly had one change that I wanted to introduce on the network, but it didn't have a lot of, let's say, value to the business. Nobody, it wasn't a customer facing thing. It was a purely underlying OSPF network change. I wanted to move to point links between my buildings and my core. Now that's an outage per building. There's 40 buildings. Things could go wrong. Some sites actually have a transit router, so there might be four sites that connect to a single site, and then that site connects back to the core. And when they say, "Well, what's this going to do for us?" and I say, "Well, it's going to bring link state advertisements down to 2 milliseconds." It wasn't very exciting or sexy to introduce all these outages. So that's where I had previously been exposed to Ansible at a convention. Where they had a developer network type thing, and they introduced me to it there. And I thought this might be a good opportunity for us to try some of this network automation I keep hearing about, and this particularly this Ansible tool that I've been told about. And it let's say the outcome was very successful. It was what we wanted to do. My operations team, instead of a big, 30 attachments with instructions per site, I gave them a one-line command. I said, log into this Linux box, run this one command, and then there's still validation and stuff, but it will go ahead and make all these changes in the orchestration in the order I want them to be made in. There shouldn't be any outages, and and it went to plan, and it was very exciting for us to see this actually work. I think the change took 45 seconds from the time they pressed entered to the network returning to its stable state. Now this opened up all kinds of doors and all kinds of thinking, and it really had um, not a bomb, but let's say a rock being dropped into a river. It really created a lot of ripples throughout design and architecture and security and operations. And wow, this is something we could really latch onto.
So well, I want to clarify. When you said OSPF point-to-point links, you're talking about the LSA type, right?
So actually, the configuration under the interface, we had just left it to the default, which is which treats it as a multi-point link. So it's actually using broadcast. And when that link comes down, when it comes back up, it has to wait for the broadcast response. But the thing is, there were /30s, so there was no reason for us not to just implicitly say you're a point-to-point link and don't broadcast. Just come up with your other point-to-point. So that was something we wanted to tune, but if it never got fixed, if we didn't address the issue, you know, other than when a building come offline and come back online, there wasn't a lot of business value, but it was something we wanted to do from a best practices point of view on the network and add some resiliency.
Sure. So I actually have two questions on this. Like going back before where you were talking about how your network had sort of scaled to a certain point, and especially some of the parts that were less, purely routed, some of the more layer two broadcast domains, like that stuff
Right,
happens often very organically, and you can't really put controls in play. People have to connect their stuff, and
right.
so you can't always tell them to stop so that you can like break that apart a little bit. Um, did that talk to me a little bit about how that having that presence in your network, just that implicit fragility, did that impact your basically did that impact the feelings that you had about either making changes in general, but especially making automated changes? Like, did you feel like it was one of those situations where you like couldn't like I can't touch it, and it's funny, it's kind of funny how often this results in something that is actually unintuitive, where you know creating more fragility by touching it less,
Right,
you actually make
right.
your networks more fragile that way. But how did you get past that hurdle?
Um, I think it was in, let's say, showing as opposed to telling. So I have the advantage that I have a fairly large lab imprint and footprint here. I could take out all 40 buildings offline very easily, which has quite a larger radius of impact. Now every app is offline. We've black holed, 40 buildings from the campus. Or the closer to the core we get with our automation, the larger the blast radius is. And it's, I don't, maybe I don't agree that networks need to be a risk adverse endeavor, but my senior management is certainly very risk adverse on the network. And to your point, I think they would rather let it die through attrition versus making a bunch of changes that could shoot ourselves in the foot. I think they're happy if 2 years go by and we forgot to flash the iOS and some bug hits us. Well, that's not as bad as we've self-imposed a problem on the network because of a change that didn't go well. So I'm constantly swimming upstream against the risk aversion for sure on the automation side of things.
What do you think? I mean, you're kind of in the middle of this, so maybe you haven't found the right answer. But from your perspective, what kind of work can you do ahead of time to help prevent that? Like if the main concern is that the automation is going to break something because of the blast radius issue, which I totally agree with, that is definitely
Right.
a concern. What, if anything, can we do ahead of time, either from a process perspective or just from adding additional steps maybe
Right.
to the workflow ahead of time to sort of ameliorate that problem?
Yeah, it's a good point, and we certainly learned. And now with my playbooks, what I tried to do, or with any of my automated changes, and this is something that was a bit of a gap when I started, was to gather as much pre-change state information that I can, go ahead and execute my change, and then capture as much post-change state information as possible, and all through the automation. Don't, it doesn't help me to automate half of this process and have someone go CLI to CLI gathering show IP route, right? Or, show SPF neighbors or something like that. So what I try to do now is massage my playbooks where I either in one orchestrated play, steps 1 to 5 are going to go capture show interface status, show SPF neighbors, show routing tables, whatever relevant information to my change. Go ahead and make my change, and then post change regather either the same routing tables, MAC tables, interface status, whatever, and they all get put into my repository centrally. And then through a tool, diffs between the pre and post changes. There's still some manual stuff there. We've also interjected some um, let me temper this. I haven't quite got there yet, but my ultimate goal with this network automation is to get to a continuous integration, continuous delivery, or CI/CD, where the playbook is just running every hour or every night or every Friday night or something, and people are just merging changes in through the back end through Git branching, and then the automated continuous integration would push those changes without anybody logging in. Nobody runs any playbooks. It's a central Git type tool or Jenkins or TFS or some central orchestrator that on a cadence will run my playbooks and suck in changes and push them out. Now in that CI/CD, I would love to interject before you deploy automatically, run some tests automatically. Go ahead and ping some interfaces from some different VRFs, or make sure you can route, or make sure the ACL is denying before you actually continue and execute that playbook. So I don't think that people should shy away from automation. I think they just need to see the forest from the trees and say, what can I really automate? It's not just about the change, and it's not just about going fast, but can I get some pre-information? Can I get some post-information? Can I run some ping tests or some trace routes or some other things in the middle of this play to make it holistic, so that my operators, when the end, they can look at some output and say, yeah, I didn't do this change. I didn't even see what the change was because my playbook just ran and did it. But at least I have the output post-execution to say, check, 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 everything is passing.
Very cool. So it almost sounds like, from your perspective, making the configuration change is only a very small part of it. You have to do a lot of analysis and data gathering and things like that.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think not to get into vendor religion or anything, but I think you on the Juniper side of the house have a little more advantage in that you can do stateful type things. Um, I'm kind of, let's say, handicapped by the Cisco world, where I can't just put an end state config through my Ansible. I actually have to handle, say I'm adding a DHCP helper or an NTP server. Well, my playbook actually has to know out, remove obsolete stuff if they're obsolete. It's not like software, which is, I repackage an exe and everything is all included and I push it out to the network. Um, with Cisco in particular, I have to, okay, if I'm making a change to a VRF interface and I change the VRF, it removes the IP address automatically, so I have to remember to put it back in. Like you're just substituting what someone would do at the CLI.
Mhm.
Like we've all heard software-defined networking and SDN is coming and it's going to change everything. And now I might be wrong, but my interpretation of software-defined networking is the abstraction from the control plane and the data plane. To me, this Ansible stuff, this network automation stuff, takes software-defined networking up to the management layer. Not the control plane or the data plane, but just the management plane. Instead of someone having to CLI onto 4,000 devices to add an NTP server, we've centralized that management plane through the Ansible box that will then go out and talk to all those central devices. Now, there's appliances. You can buy the vendor solution, pizza box that goes into your data center. I found they will do 65%, maybe 75% of what you want it to do. If you think about software defined access or software defined WAN, or let's say something like prime infrastructure, excuse me, um, you can do 60 or 70% of what you do. I find that's the advantage in bringing it in house and writing your own code. You can tailor it to do 100% of your config tailored for your environment without needing hooks into some expensive third party centralized controller, right? You're kind of making your own controller.
Yeah, you guys hear me okay?
Yeah,
Yeah,
go for it.
All right. Didn't know how. Is it too loud?
You're perfect.
perfect.
Okay, good. Yeah, sorry. Of course, my microphone completely disappeared off my PC in the middle of the stream. So, so it's interesting you say that. There's all these systems. Software-defined networking is a lot of times it revolves around very networky things and network systems, right? But when you're using, a lot of times there's still a last mile with all the other things you have to touch in your environment, like help desk, like ticketing systems or email
Right.
or messaging or maybe you want to auto generate a document or auto update a document or something. I mean, when you say it only does 65% of what you need, like how much of that last mile stuff do you think makes up that percentage?
Yeah, I know I've had some limited success with using, let's say, Prime infrastructure to go ahead and push a bunch of commands through the CLI. It's a GUI based thing. It's kind of clunky. Um, it works for very simplistic changes, but not if I want to orchestrate something. Like I wouldn't be able to tell a central controller, okay, go on to, well, maybe at least the controllers that I use. I can't say, okay, go to the remote router interface one and set OSPF point to point. Now go to the corresponding uplink on the core and put the same command in. It's kind of hard to orchestrate between multiple devices or service chaining, let's call it. If I want to go to one device and add 20 lines of config, that's easy. But what if they need to go in a certain order across multiple devices, which is, when we're adding a VLAN, I have to add it to the trunk, I have to add it to the uplink port of the switch above, or a VRF. There's it's very rare that I find that I'm only making changes on a singular box. Even if I'm just provisioning a layer 2 VLAN, well, it's got to be added to the trunk. It has to be added to the uplink to the distribution switch. I should be setting some spanning tree values. There's a bunch of things that I find it very difficult through these GUI based controllers to do that type of work. Um, and a step beyond, because Ansible, because of its extensibility, it has modules for, say, an F5 or um, a NetApp storage array, or I can actually write a playbook that okay, let's not just add the VLAN and the SVI. Let's set up the F5 for the load balancing for this, and let's go ahead and set up our storage that's needed on the back end. So when an application developer comes along and said, I need X, Y, and Z, I need some network, I need some load balancing, I need some storage, we can write these holistic playbooks that orchestrate the whole service chain, and then we can present that to the app to say your app's ready to go. It's been automatically configured, it's in our source of truth, um, without having to put in 6 tickets. Okay, here's my ticket for my storage team, here's my ticket for my load balancer team, here's my ticket for my core network team, and hopefully all 3 of them collaborate and orchestrate this change together. You take control of that and can centralize all of it through your playbooks.
So that's actually one of my biggest things about Ansible, because I do have a programming background, so I'm very not shy to go deeper into Python or even Go or any other language. So for me, like a lot of times the concept of people ask me like what tool should I use, and the answer is always it depends, because you have to figure out your own requirements, right? But
Right.
one thing that I think that does set Ansible apart, because there are some things that I don't want to do in Ansible, like really advanced data manipulation. I would just want to go to Python for that.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
but the advantage I think that you pointed out is very key, right? With not just Ansible. Ansible is a good example, but this is true in a lot of places. Folks will sort of gravitate towards reinventing the wheel, but Ansible has a tremendous amount of integrations already built in. I had the same experience when I worked on the Stackstorm team, right? Folks would say, they would always say something like, well, why couldn't, I just build this in X? I'm like, well, you could, but why? Like, why would you bother?
Right.
All of this software is already out there. It's open, it's freely accessible, and it's been battle hardened in environments. I'm really glad you brought that point up, because that's one point I think the industry as a whole doesn't quite, have the muscle memory on.
Yeah. It's been quite the journey. I think I, I had to kind of think a little bit bigger than just my Ansible playbooks. We were talking about this before the stream started, and yeah, I can take two sticks and rub them together and eventually get a flame going. But once I found the Zippo lighter, once I had better tooling and instrumentation, like when I actually found a true code editor, like when I moved to VS Code from using Notepad or TextPad or Notepad++ or whatever,
Yep.
that was a huge like a huge discovery for me. And then I had all of their extensible plugins, so I could have a YAML extension and a Python extension, and it's checking my syntax and it's helping me write this code versus trying to blindly do it trial and error via Notepad or TextPad++. So that was one giant leap forward was finding VS Code, and then the next thing I had a senior executive say, yeah, it sounds like you're doing some real cool stuff with this automation. And he was calling it scripting. I didn't correct him because it's, whatever.
Yeah.
But can you get those scripts, into our central source control and version control? We have a whole floor of developers that are writing software, and it's all version controlled, it's all source controlled. Why don't you work with some of our developers, and they'll cut you a repo, and you can start stashing your stuff in the repository? So then once I had a Git repo with a GUI front end in TFS, and I was using VS Code Editor to write my code. Now there was some learning curve there, and I wouldn't say I'm a Git expert. Ohshitgit.com. If you're getting into Git, go to ohshitgit.com. It's a great site. There's also learngitbranching.js.org. I'm not related or affiliated with any of these sites. I'm just throwing them out there.
Sure.
But once I got the hang of Git, then it was really powerful. Now I have source control, history of my changes. I have branching strategy where I have, so this is all kind of recommendations or tips that I would make, or kind of why I wrote the book. Have a master branch in Git, and that represents your network, your intent, your source of truth, however you want to look at it, perfect and holy. Now I need a change. I have a bug fix request or an enhancement request, or I need to add something. I'm going to make a branch, call that branch, bug fix 2, bug fix whatever, work in that branch, test out my playbooks in the branch. Once it's all confirmed and good, I merge that back into master. Everyone around me on my distributed team can look at my Git, my pull requests, and my Git commit history, and figure out exactly what I was doing with that code. So now we're really working like software developers. It happens to be, a Cisco ISR that I'm pushing code to, but we've abstracted all of that. It's all templates and data models, and what there's some big wins come along with this. When I'm writing these playbooks, kind of that point of capturing pre and post change, we're also doing self documentation. So I'm generating markdown files, Excel spreadsheets, PDFs, whatever you want, automatically. So when I push when I run my playbook, it's actually updating my documentation at the same time, and all that documentation is stored in Git. So it's all version controlled in history, and it's been a huge, like just a completely revolutionary way of operating a network where we're finding, my tools are, I'm no longer in Putty, I'm no longer in Cisco Prime, I'm in VS Code writing data models or Jinja templates, or I'm in TFS looking at pull requests. I also have some more visibility now that I'm using a central tool like that, where some of my juniors, I can empower them to go write your own code. And when you do your pull request, it will come to me for review, and I can do some QA on the code. Looks good, release the pull request, and it gets pulled into the master branch. So I have, there's up to 6 or 7 people all working on this code at the same time, and we don't have conflicts. I don't have files called, old, new one, new two. It's all
We get
central
change
in.
plan v1.0 new final.
Right. So all of that's been
Really
eliminated.
final.
Really final. Yeah, that's right. Um,
But I know
so it's
I absolutely love what you're saying, because like what you're saying here is, um, you know, we hear about all these terms, and like, you know, if you're a network engineer and you keep hearing about network automation, you're putting it off. You're listening to terms like Python and Git, and you're like, whatever, that's developer stuff. The case you're making
right.
is absolutely those have a gigantic use case in the software space, but we have an identical use case just with a different payload in the networking space. Same process, same advantages, just different coat of paint, basically different specific use case.
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's when you look at it, when I CLI in and do a show run, what is that? That's code of a kind, right? We've configured them configurations or whatever, but it's really just code. And so, and what I really like, and this might seem counterintuitive, but if you can have a lab, or let's say I have one distribution switch in a building, and I know that that's the way I want everything. That's how I want the end state of all of my devices. The AAA is right, the radius is right, the time server is right, they have the right DHCP helpers on SVIs, whatever the configuration is you want. You can take that show run and work backwards from there. You don't need to reinvent the wheel, right? So I look at a config and I say, okay, host name, John Switch. Well, John Switch is a great thing to make a variable. Every switch on my whole network is going to have a line that says host name something. That's the perfect thing to abstract. Let's take that and put it in a data model. So let's say I have 10 switches, I have 10 files, each with the host name. That's the data model for that file, my intent, my source of truth. This is, I want the switch one's host name to be switch one. So in my data model, I have a variable called host name, and I put in the host name. In my Jinja template, I just call that variable. So now I've just scaled 10. Sure, 10 isn't very impressive. What if you have 4,000 switches and you want all their host names to follow a convention? It's just a variable. You're just calling a variable. It's a simple for loop or an if statement. Um, you're not going to be writing arrays in Ansible or doing crazy stuff. It's basic if then else logic or for and for logic. If you can handle those two things, you should dive into network automation. The other tip I would give, and I didn't follow this advice myself, but I sort of jumped right in the fire making production changes with this and tried to learn backwards from there. If I were to do it all over again, I would write some simple playbooks to do network reconnaissance, network discovery, network documentation. Write a playbook that you can't wreck anything. We understand the blast radius is huge, and you don't want to take down networks and explain to management, well, I was trying to learn Ansible. That's not going to fly, right?
Mm-hmm.
So take something like show VLANs, show VRFs, show IPS, OSPF neighbors, whatever it is you want. Make a playbook to output those to a file and run that playbook across your campus. If you run that playbook every week, now you have a weekly inventory of all your MAC addresses on your network or all your routing tables or whatever it is. Not to get too deep into the Ansible world, but you're going to hear, along with these terms, Git and Python and source control and version control and CI/CD, item potency. It's a really fancy long word that you're going to love saying in meetings. Um, but that to me is one of the real advantages of Ansible, is that it's item potent, meaning I could have an intended config of say 100 lines, and if my running config is 100 lines and they all match, it won't push any changes and it won't report any changes. If I add line 201 to my intent and run it in check mode, meaning I can run it and not execute it, just show me what the playbook would actually change, it'll show me the one line delta, and that's what it will push. But if it's item potent, meaning it matches my intent, every time I run this playbook, if it comes back green saying I'm not making any changes, then I know that my running config on the network matches my intended config in my source of truth. And then, once you reach that point across your full network, then you can start looking at things like continuous integration, continuous delivery, automated testing, and there's other virtual environments. I believe you could do this in Packet Tracer or Virl or virtualized environments on the cloud if you just want to play with Ansible a little bit.
So I have a quick question on I don't know what kind of teams that you generally work with within your environment, but a lot of times, especially these days, this was less true maybe 15 years ago when outsourcing was in fashion, but I think now it's very much a commonplace experience, at least in the environments that I've worked in, for there to be an applications team or a development shop for in-house application building. Um, um, and that's only becoming more popular, especially now that the cloud is happening. My question is, has your as you pick up these skills and as your team starts to use these tools and become more acquainted with developer terminology and tooling and process, has that changed the relationship that you've had with internal applications folks? And if so, in what way?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It has certainly brought, let's say, a few of the key senior people a lot closer together. I'm a lot closer now with my counterparts in application, partly because I had to go to them with my hat in hand and saying, someone sent me your way to get a TFS repository. I don't know what it is or what I'm doing with it, but could you help me get one?
Mhm.
And then from there, it was, okay, I don't really know what Git even is. Could you point me in the right direction? So I've learned a lot from the application side of the house. And I think through their own curiosity, um, they were curious as to well, show me what you're doing with the network, right? So I showed a few of them some of this stuff, and they're on board. They think this is great, and I don't know if it's a chicken and an egg, or if they're playing a bit of a game of chicken, but uh, they're like, yeah, push for continuous integration, push for automated changes on the network. I think because if the organization says, well, the network team's doing it, why can't us application guys do it, right? So I think they're looking for us to be a bit of a canary in the coal mine, to look at CI/CD and truly having, um, a job actually configures the whole network every night at midnight. Wow, that's pretty intense. How would we do that on applications, right? So we're learning quite a bit
Sure.
from each other. Now I think I've had this philosophical debate with a few people. I don't know if, like, I think if you were getting into this and you had an application developer, they don't need to know the OSI stack. They don't really even need to know CEDAR or IP routing or anything to do with it, right? You could send them a running config and say, look, here's what I want to do. I want to turn this into templates and data models. Could you help me with that code? I'm sure they could pick it up and help you, versus a pure networking type person who's maybe CCNA or Network Plus certified, doesn't know the first thing about development or a for loop. It might take them longer to ramp up than it would take to ramp up a developer to the very basics they would need to understand about a network.
Uh,
So I don't know. I don't know that maybe 5 years, 7 years from now, is there really going to be a position called, network analyst? Well, maybe they're just software developers. Maybe your pool of software developers now includes 4 or 5 people that have an architecture, lean towards architecture, infrastructure. Um, I don't know. Maybe this network as an isolated silo might dissolve over the next few years as this stuff starts to mature, right? And now everyone's just a developer. You just happen to be developing on the Juniper platform or the F5 platform. Something that may be coming.
Hmm.
you said something earlier. Maybe I missed this when my headset was out. But you said you have these YAML files and you have these playbooks. And before the call, at least, you said you've even written a handful of, I'm not huge, but just a handful of Python plugins for Ansible.
Yeah.
All these things are going into your Git repository, especially the YAML, the data
Yeah.
models.
Yeah. So if we take a step back, so the kind of framework, so maybe I should have started with some of this about Ansible. And again, I don't work for Ansible or Red Hat or anything. I'm just a consumer of their products. Um, it's agentless. So as long as if you can SSH from a Linux box that's running Ansible onto a switch or a router, that's really all you need. There's no agent that goes out there, and it's not, like Python is a full-blown programming language, whereas Ansible is really just a framework that sits on top of the Python. Now there's filter plugins that you can write your own Python. I've written some to strip white spaces or to do a natural sort on interfaces, so they sort 1 through 10, 11 through 19, etc. You can write, if you're handy with Python, you can write your own plugins to kind of override or enhance the basic Ansible framework. Now, in terms of YAML and where YAML is going to come in, there's um, there's a couple of high-level folders in Ansible. So there's one called group vars or group variables, and one called host vars or host variables. Now, your group vars are going to be variables that apply to multiple devices. So in terms of how I have mine laid out, I follow a standard core distribution access type campus. So I have a group variable called distribution, and it's all the variables that are specific to my distribution layer. I have an even higher level group variable called enterprise. So in my enterprise group variable, it's things that apply to all downstream devices.
Like
So
banner
think
of the
about
day.
banner of the day, NTP servers, IP helpers, radius servers, anything that's going to be exactly the same on every device through your campus, you're going to stuff them all in a group variable. Now, the host variable is actually things that apply only to a single host. So that's going to be things like host name, the management IP address, um, the VLANs that are presented on that switch, other things that are very specific just to that host. Now, I consider those YAML data models are intent or our source of truth, or it abstracts it. So they should be human readable. It shouldn't be a bunch of networking terminology or verbiage. It should be very human readable in the YAML format so that I could hand it to an operator or even a non-technical person and say, here's my core, and here's all the variables that I want to, um, the important information. So I'm going to abstract it from the actual configurate lines of configuration. So then once I have my data models and I model my data, then we have Jinja 2 templates. And Jinja 2 templates are going to reference the group and host variables to complete their template. So again, I'm going to have host name and then a variable, host name is my variable. It loops through, I don't know, 1,000, 2,000, 10, however many devices are in my inventory file, and it creates my intended config and will push those intended configs to my devices. Because it's all in Git, it's all version controlled, so I could look at my intent or my data model for any of my devices through any point in time. It makes it very easy to find what changed and where and on what devices, because you're going to look at, say, a Git pull request or a Git commit, and I look at the commit and say, oh, I see developer 2 has added 3 VLANs to this switch, added it to the trunk, presented it to the building distribution switch, or whatever. Once you have that, then those same Jinja templates, you can have them output to, say, a markdown file. So now not only am I documenting my intent, I can actually put it in markdown and manipulate it to be in tables, or a CSV file, or however output you want. So you can actually look at your intent in a human readable format. That's been the biggest. Now, if you want to start Ansible day one, I would suggest that's probably a day 5 or 6 thing in Ansible. Start with tactical playbooks using the iOS command or Juniper OS command to add a VLAN or to show some output. Start with little tactical changes, and then you can build up towards what I call full configuration management, a data model and a template, and the two combine to give me my intended config.
Yeah, it almost sound you had yourself when you were explaining how you got to where you were, there was a progression, right? You started you just had collections of files on a hard drive somewhere, and you were trying to manage that, and you sort of, graduated each time using developer tools to
Yes.
manage what is effectively a developer problem, but
Yeah,
in the
it's
context of
true.
network configuration.
And we're trying to see what else can we automate now. So we haven't got to, let's say, our firewalls, but certain firewalls that we use have Ansible modules. Our F5s have Ansible modules. Our NetApp storage has Ansible modules. So I think this is going to continue to snowball to, to as far as we can take it. If there's an Ansible plugin or a module that I can use, we should really try to leverage that. And it's really because of it's almost because of the Git information, because I have this rich Git source of truth, and self-documenting, and totally version controlled. I don't know about you, not in this environment, but in a previous environment, my senior network engineer, every time you update something, make a little notepad file in a folder that lists what you changed. And that's kind of how we tracked what was going on the network. Other places use ticketing systems, but if you're like me, sometimes you get into that rat's nest of a ticketing system just trying to find what changed when and who approved it and what the code was. It can be challenging in a large enterprise environment to just simple tracking of what changed when and when. Like every time there's an incident, to me, I almost default to what changed. Everything worked yesterday, it's not working today. What has changed? Having everything in Git or in a TFS repository that's just a Git front end, it takes all of this complexity of finding out what changed and on what devices. It becomes very easy. It's just a graphical point and click, and you can see what changed.
How do you handle reverting back from a bad change?
That's a good point. Reverting back is I try to capture the full running config um, as part of my pre-changes, to have the full config. And then in my post change, if I don't get to the post change output, um, it's a fancy way of saying it's a manual reversion at this point. I haven't got it to the point where it will detect something has gone wrong and self-roll back. I have not got there yet. We have played with the config replace option on our 4500s. So certain Cisco platforms, you can present a target end state config and do a config replace, which is more of a stateful change. When I do the stateful config replace, then I can automatically roll back to the previous state. But changes that we're just doing through CLI, um, it's very much a manual reversion at this point.
Cool. Well, we're nearing the top of the time. I do want to make sure that I get some details from you on like what kind of the question always comes up. How do I get started? That's like the number one
Yep.
question every single talk I ever give, or even attend. That's the number one question. So, Anthony, go ahead and provide an answer if you will to that. If somebody's looking at this and they're still skeptical, they're like, "Oh my God, this is all just developer nonsense."
Yeah.
What would you tell them to say? Like, no, like here's the first step you can take.
So I know for me, and it depends on your shop. My shop is I don't want to say Linux adverse, but we're a Windows shop. It's very hard for me to find a production Linux box that can talk to my in-band management or my out-of-band management. Um, and I don't want to take too long to answer this because I know people want to hear this, but Windows 10. So if you're running Windows 10 and you can putty from that same machine into a switch, install the Windows Subsystem for Linux, WSL, turn that on. Go ahead and get Ubuntu from the Microsoft Store and install that. And then from that Ubuntu box, you should be able to install Ansible. And then you can run playbooks from your local Windows 10 machine through Ubuntu without needing a CentOS box or a Red Hat a RHEL box. You can do it through Windows 10 through Ubuntu. And that should get you started. I would write a simple play to do, let's say, show interface status. Use the iOS command module to write yourself a simple playbook to do show interface status and output that to a text file. Take that as homework and try to figure out if you can do that. If you can do that, then it's any command you want, right? If you want show IP route, it's just a matter of changing the one line you're feeding Ansible. Once you're comfortable with iOS commands or Junos commands, graduate to the configuration module. Okay, let me try to add something to this device or modify a configuration item. And then just keep building on your successes. I would recommend that you really spend a lot of time on docs.ansible.com and look at the networking modules. It's very easy to understand and it's very well laid out. And don't be shy. Don't be afraid. Don't take risks. Try to, because this is going to change your life. You are going to get hours and hours, tens of hours back in return. It's a very, very small investment in yourself that's going to pay huge dividends in accuracy, agility, speed, compliance. I cannot stress this enough. This is like jumping, what's changed on the CLI over the last 30 years? We went from Telnet to SSH. That's probably the only innovation on the CLI in 35 years, right? This is the new innovation at the CLI. That's probably the the strongest way I could sell this.
I like it. That's a good pitch. It is. It is. People. It's great to have people on the show that are actually doing this in production and not pontificating about it. So that's. I mean, it's a great. Your whole story is awesome, and I'm very happy that we were able to get you on the show to talk about it.
Yeah, I appreciate your time and thanks for having me. And I really encourage you to go out and look at this stuff because it's if you wait too long, you're going to be at risk. This is the next generation of network infrastructure management is network automation. And if you don't start rowing in that boat, you're going to sink. I really believe that.
So why don't you go ahead and plug your book actually while you're here?
Yeah, so if you look up Automate Your Network on Amazon, it's self-published. I published it in March. It's my poor wife was my editor for about 6 months, so she's probably the next biggest expert in network automation would be my wife, even though she doesn't work in IT at all, but she was my editor. There's an ebook and a paperback copy, and yeah, I tried to make it cheap. It was just a pet project. I wanted to try to help people learn how to automate their networks. And I go to big conventions. I meet quite a few people in the field, and far too many people ask me, "What's Ansible?" And I'm shocked. I can't believe you're not even using it. You don't even know what it is yet. So invest some time. Check out my book. I would love it if you bought a copy. That would be great.
All right. Okay, I think we're gonna wrap up. And yeah, thank you, John, for coming on. That was awesome. Thank you, Matt, for taking the helm when my headset imploded. Um,
No worries.
you asked good questions, man.
I was
I'm
just I was just admiring the toad on your shoulder, and it inspired me.
Yeah, I actually cleaned my office before I started this. I was looking at old videos we published. It was time. It was time to clean it.
You got rid of the Thai food order on your whiteboard.
All right.
All right. Thanks very much, team.
Sure, sure. So, by the way, everyone, you can follow John on Twitter. It's at his name, at John_Capobianco. We will put a link to his Twitter handle and his book in the description on our YouTube site. Please follow us on Twitter at NRE Labs. You can also check out our tutorials on our site, labs.networkreliability.engineering. I'm Cloud Toad. You also follow me on Twitter. And our co-host was Matt Oswald at Meerdin, Mierdin, which I have to think about every time I spell it. With that, signing off.